All right.
You're on vibrate anyways, right?
Yeah, I think I am. Okay, Eli, all you.
Cool. So before we get into some of the specifics, what is your connection to the Orioles these days? I know you.
Not much other than being a fan. When the Orioles sold, when the Angelos family sold the club to the Rubensteins, that was pretty much the end of my run of, I don't know, almost 30 years with the club. But I had been doing less and less as John Angelos took over from his father. John had his own worldview, and sometimes I shared it and sometimes I didn't.
Gotcha. And obviously one of the major characters we'll be focusing on for this project will be William Donald Schaefer.
It's interesting you use the word character, Eli. He was certainly brilliant and a great politician, and in some respects larger than life. Some would view that as being a character. I think there was always an element of genius in what he did. You wouldn't have known it right away, though. Sometimes you said to yourself, what? But there was always an element of political genius in what he did.
Can you sort of describe your relationship with him, what your position and role entails?
Sure. I didn't really know him very well when he was the mayor of Baltimore. I came to know him because I had been counsel to the Maryland Senate under Mickey Steinberg in 1984 and 85, I guess part of 86, when at that time there was a different governor by the name of Harry Hughes. And so in the role of being counsel to the Maryland Senate, I got to know the procedures and the people and the issues and the like. So it just so happened by circumstance that Don Schaefer, who was mayor, decided he was going to run for governor and selected the Senate president, Mickey Steinberg, to be his running mate. So I was sort of brought into the campaign because I was attached to the lieutenant governor candidate, essentially, and provided legal advice and counsel to the campaign during that whole campaign, which ultimately led to me being selected by Don Schaefer to be his first chief counsel and legislative officer at the ripe old age of 29. And also I headed the transition between the two governors for the period of time before Schaefer took office on the administrative and legal side. So I got to know Schaefer pretty well during the transition and got to know him very well, obviously, as his counsel. In those days, Eli, unlike today, the Attorney General's office was not seen as counsel to the governor. The Attorney General's office was seen as counsel to the people, to the agencies, and had a love-hate relationship essentially with the governor's office. Because when the governor would do things that they thought was not consistent with either the law or the Constitution, they would let him know that, and he needed to have his own representation. Today, things have gotten a little more blurred, particularly in Washington, but at that time, governors had their own attorneys, and the Attorney General had its own function. So I got to know him pretty well.
And what was he like to work with?
Character.
How so?
I'll use your word. He was incredibly dynamic to the point of being inspirational, largely because he was wedded to being governor. He had no real family life. He had no children. He didn't have a wife. He had a friend. We called her the first friend, Hilda Mae Snoops. But his whole world was governing, the ordinary person, caring about their world and trying to fix it. And he was always exasperated because he could never fix everything. And he could never get everything he wanted done. And he wanted everything done immediately. He had a phrase called "do it now," which meant don't bother me with details, get it done. And that, in some respects, was incredibly empowering to me and the other young members of the cabinet, because it wasn't built on bureaucracy. It was built on trying to find a solution to whatever problem of the day the governor may have or believe. And he came into office just roaring and ready to go. He got elected on a Tuesday in November. He had us in the transition office Wednesday morning, the day after the election. We'd all been up all night reveling in the fact we had just won the election. And he expected us all to be in the office who were the folks that were involved in the transition, me included, the next day at 9 o'clock in the morning. Some of us, I won't name who, some of us went there in the same suit, tie, and jacket and shoes and everything else that we were out the night before in because we didn't go home. So we were there at 9 o'clock. Not particularly wide awake, but we were there. I found him to be extraordinarily amazing and difficult to understand at times because as a lawyer, you're trained to think in a linear fashion. Facts, law, outcome, precedent. He never thought that way. In fact, point of fact, the times I aggravated him the most as counsel, and he fired me twice while I was counsel, the things that aggravated him the most were when I would say to him, you can't do that, or the Constitution doesn't let you do that, or you can't move that money out of that budget because it's restricted funds. He came into my office one day and he fired me, literally fired me. He goes, you're not giving me the advice I want. I said, well, that's not my job. So he hired me back the next day. But those kind of things would happen because of his thinking. But interestingly enough, I've made my career adopting his way of thinking. And it's had a lot to do with the success I've had in the sports law practice. You know, people say that I'm a pioneer in sports law. No, I just happen to have had a lot of sports clients when I was a young lawyer, and all of a sudden it's now a discipline. It wasn't a discipline when I did it. So anyway, I hope that answers your question about him. I thought the world of him.
And how would you describe, you mentioned his way of thinking, what would you describe his way of thinking to be?
Results oriented. Don't bother me with why or how you think it can't be done. Here is the problem. You tell me the solution. And that's pretty much what happened here with Camden Yards. That's the kind of thinking he had. Don't bother me with details. Just get it done.
Gotcha. And someone we talked to, I think, mentioned that he never questioned Schaefer's motives, but sometimes maybe his methods could be, I think, brutal was the word used.
I wouldn't call them brutal. What I would say is that they were sometimes hard to understand. In years and years later, things came back to me as to why he may have done something the way he did it. He loved to prod and motivate the people that worked for him by sometimes giving us the same projects. He would give one project to somebody in one agency and give somebody in another agency the exact same project. And then he would sort of play them off against each other and then try to figure out what he wanted to do with it. And you think that's kind of odd. Why would you do that? Well, when you go to a doctor, you get a second opinion, right? His way of thinking was, I don't know the answer yet, but I got really smart people around me. One of them's going to give me the right answer, and I don't really care that two people are working on the same thing. Doesn't matter to me. And he wouldn't even tell you sometimes that you were working on the same thing as somebody else was. It was unique. It was a unique experience, and I've often said it's the greatest job that I ever had, and I underscore the word had because it was full-time all the time, every day, every weekend, every night. I got calls at 4 in the morning. I got calls, on weekends, on holidays, come to the mansion on this day or that day, and it was consuming to do it. And then, of course, we had the pressures of also doing what we had to do to get things accomplished. But yeah.
And with Oriole Park at Camden Yards specifically, how instrumental would you say he was to achieve?
He was? You wouldn't have Oriole Park at Camden Yards without William Donald Schaefer. It would not have happened. It wouldn't even have been an idea, much less a result. See, do you want to know the background of how he got so interested in doing this? Because I think it helps you or anyone understand the motivation. It was his singular most important project and his top priority in his first year in office. Now, why is that? With all the things that government has to care about, from roads and schools and 1,000 other problems, why is it that building a stadium, this time it was a stadium, was the most important thing on this man's agenda? And the reason was it was the first and only time in his political career where he was absolutely embarrassed. In March of 1984, in the latter part of March, the Baltimore Colts left for Indianapolis in a snowy, horrific morning event. Preceding that, Schaefer had attempted to negotiate with the then owner of the Baltimore Colts, a guy by the name of Robert Irsay. Irsay was a cantankerous, difficult, hard-drinking person. He did not get along with Schaefer, and Schaefer did not get along with him. He was very, very concerned, he being Irsay, that Baltimore was not capable of continuing to support an NFL franchise. And he didn't like Memorial Stadium at all. Most owners in the NFL at that time were flexing their muscles and wanting to get out of dual-purpose stadiums. For many, many years, up until the 1980s, virtually every single stadium was a dual-purpose stadium, baseball, football, in those cities that had it. Kansas City had broken that mold with Arrowhead Park, with one baseball and one football stadium on the same campus. And then all of a sudden, every NFL owner wanted that. So when they were unable to reach an agreement, and back and forth Schaefer and Irsay went, without ever telling Schaefer, he was packing up all of the goods and memorabilia of the Colts and all their equipment, packing it onto a Mayflower truck. And Schaefer got a heads up from a reporter that this was happening and drove out to the Colts offices in Owings Mills and stood on the curb while the snow was falling, watching the moving truck leave. And every newspaper and every television station was recording him standing there, basically powerless. For a man who lived in a world of gathering power, the fact that he, A, failed to keep the Colts, and B, was standing there on the side of a curb in the snow, watching the Colts leave powerless, was about the biggest motivating force a human being could ever have. And so it was heavy on his mind that he had lost the Colts on his watch, and he didn't want to lose the Orioles. And his concern about the Orioles was, in 1979, the Orioles were bought by Edward Bennett Williams from the Hofberger family for a whopping $13.2 million, I want to tell you. So Williams was a institution in Washington, D.C., perhaps the greatest lawyer of his time. He was called the man to see in Washington. I mean, actually, his biography is called The Man to See. And so Schaefer was rightly concerned that if a Washingtonian of that magnitude, who also, by the way, had a part ownership in the Washington Redskins, the team, as it was then named, would gravitate the team from old, dilapidated Memorial Stadium to someplace in D.C. And so heavy on Schaefer's mind was he had just lost the Colts, and the Orioles were now under the ownership of a Washingtonian, who, by the way, would not sign a lease extension at Memorial Stadium. All he would agree to sign is 1-year leases, and he would wait until the beginning of spring training to do that. So there was some real trepidation, although to his credit, Edward Bennett Williams never once said he was moving the team, always complimented Baltimore, always complimented the Oriole fans, and never gave any indication he was going to move. But then again, he never tied his lot to any long-term deal in Baltimore. Then, when Schaefer was running for office, it was revealed, this is now fast forward to 1986, it was revealed that Edward Bennett Williams had terminal cancer. And so all of that was stewing in Schaefer's mind. Who would take over the team? Would it be Mr. Williams' wife? Why would she care about Baltimore? All that was percolating in his mind. It was also percolating in the mind of Governor Harry Hughes. People don't recall this now, but the Stadium Authority was actually initially begun under Harry Hughes in the 1985 session. He didn't do much. He just created a template of some agency that may have some authority at some point over sports if they could ever figure out what to do. But Hughes also commissioned the Mannequin Commission. The Mannequin Commission was the first futile but first attempt at trying to organize thoughts as to could there be a new stadium for the Orioles and perhaps to engage the NFL or not. And if so, where would it be located? How would it be funded? What would the parameters of it be? And so the Mannequin Commission went about studying where there was land between here and Washington. Schaefer hated that commission, largely because there were no Baltimoreans on it. And he wasn't about to let anybody make a determination that there was going to be a new stadium for the Baltimore Orioles that he didn't have a part or a hand in. So he tried to kill the Mannequin Commission. So all this is happening while the election cycle is running.
And going back to the night of the Colts leaving,
Yep.
can you sort of describe the mood of the city and I guess any stories you
It was-
of him and what his reaction to it was?
It was mourning. The city was in mourning. It was as if the city had been told that it was a second-class city, that it wasn't worthy of an NFL franchise, that its mayor was powerless, and that the fans who had poured their hearts out to the Colts and Johnny Unitas and all of the great heroes of the day was now an afterthought and somebody's museum.
Did he say that he was embarrassed, or could you just tell?
Schaefer wouldn't use those words. That's not the nature of the man. But it was more than abundantly clear. More than abundantly clear. And his aides, who had known him for a long time, who I got to know very, very well, Mark Wasserman and others, Laney Lebo, confided in me many, many times that was heart-wrenching for the man, just heart-wrenching.
And was there any thought or interest from him or anyone around him about trying to salvage Memorial Stadium for baseball purposes?
Oh, 100%. So Schaefer had appointed as the counterpoint to the Mannequin Commission, which was appointed by Governor Hughes. Schaefer appointed the Buddha Commission, led by a guy named Hank Buddha, who was the then CEO of Bell Atlantic, which is now Verizon. All the telephone companies, when people used to have these things, were called Bell Atlantic, Bell New York, whatever. But he was the regional director of the Bell companies, and Hank Buddha was given clear marching orders from Schaefer: find me a location in the city, and tell me how you think it could get done. You're a businessman. Tell me how you think it could get done. Buddha came back with Plan A, which was renovate Memorial Stadium, and Plan B was 3 locations in the city, one of which was Camden Yards. The Mannequin Commission came back with Laurel, Falston, and Edgewater, none of which worked for Schaefer. The Buddha Commission came back with a couple of locations plus the old warehouse district called the Camden Warehouse District. So that all was nothing more, those things were nothing more than commission reports. So when Schaefer was elected, and we had our meeting the next day that some of us came ill-prepared to, the next day when we were all more fresh and ready, I'm sitting in my office in Preston Street, which is where I had set up shop for the transition, and I hadn't even hired my staff yet, which turned out to be the world's greatest group of lawyers. That to this day, I'm stunned that I was able to get those folks involved, and I'll talk to you about a little bit about them later on because they played an incredible role in all of this and also in the history of the state thereafter. But so I'm all by myself at this point, and Schaefer comes into my office with a gentleman by the name of Herb Belgrad. If you haven't heard of Herb, you will as you do this story. Herb was the first chairman of the Stadium Authority. At the time, as I said to you, it was nothing more than there wasn't much to it. The Stadium Authority had no powers yet. I gave them that in a statute that we'll talk about in a minute. But they did have a responsibility, which was to report back to the Buddha Commission as to what it would take to keep the Orioles here and what it would take to one day attract an NFL franchise to come back. And they had done their work diligently. Herb was also a lawyer, and he is the former president of the Maryland State Bar Association, a very dedicated gentleman and had a lot of civic pride, worked very, very hard to try to answer the clarion call that Schaefer had given him. So they walk into my office in whatever day in November that was, and sit down and they say, listen, we're going to be releasing the Buddha Commission report. This is Herb speaking. And we're going to be making a recommendation. We think we know where the stadium will go, and we think we have an idea about how it ought to be addressed. But Don, that's how I referred to Schaefer, but Don wants to tell you his thoughts first before I fill you in on the details we have. And so Schaefer says, you know, this is falling under your responsibility. You're the lawyer and you're head of the legislative office. We're going to be doing 2 stadiums. I said, do what, 2 stadiums? He said, yeah, Herb tells me, because he always makes somebody else the reason he did something. Herb tells me that there's no way we can keep the Orioles unless they have a dedicated stadium, and there's no way we're going to attract an NFL team unless we have a dedicated stadium, so you got to do 2. I said, Herb, is that right? I mean, is that what you're going to report? He says, yeah. I said, have you given any thought to where you want it? He said, yes. We want to take the furthest point south in the city we can go without actually crossing into Anne Arundel County, because we want to get as close as we can to D.C., put us on a highway so that Ed Williams' D.C. friends can easily get to the ballpark, and so have no reason to think about ever moving the team. It's going to go in the furthest point south. I said, what's the furthest point south? He said, the Camden Yards area. I had never even seen the Camden Yards area. At that time, there wasn't the flyover ramp from I-95 that connects you now to the ballpark. I'll get to that in a minute. Nobody would go down to that district. It had the old incinerator, which they still have down there, where they, burn people's trash. It was a rat-infested area of old warehouses because they'd come off the docks, and the warehouse that you now see that's so prestigious and great for the ballpark, that's where they unloaded all their goods. Well, when you unload food, stuffs, and things of that nature, you're going to get rats. The place was just a derelict area, but had a lot of businesses. It had 65, I could be wrong, it might be 68, somewhere between 65 and 70 businesses we knew were located there. So I said to Belgrade, I said, Herb, how are you going to get those properties? He says, well, you're going to have to figure out how eminent domain works. I said, we're going to confiscate them? He said, well, you're going to have to. We're going to have to figure out a way to get those properties. I said, okay, that's challenge number 2. Challenge number 1 was 2 stadiums. I said, have you guys given any thought to how you're going to pay for this? I mean, what is the funding source for it? And Schaefer says, no, but you can't use any general obligation bonds. I said, why can't you? General obligation bonds, by the way, are the bonds that are used to do roads and schools and infrastructure, and they're backed by the full faith and credit of the state of Maryland, and the debt on those bonds is paid by taxes. Schaefer said, no taxes. I said, no taxes? He says, no general obligation bond, no taxes. You're telling me it's 2 stadiums, and you're telling me that you don't even have the land yet. So what is it you want me to do? And Schaefer gets up out of his seat, gets up and he goes, Junior, that's your job. And they both walk out. Literally, that's what happens. So landing on my desk now is the governor's #1 top priority, to build 2 stadiums. I can't use general obligation bonds. I can't use tax dollars. I don't have the land, and I don't even have an authority yet that can execute upon the transaction. So I went home that night. I said to my wife, I said, be careful what you wish for in life. I've got this job, and it's a great job, but I've now just been handed the most impossible task known to mankind. I don't know how I'm going to do this. She goes, well, is there anybody you can call and discuss it with? I said, no, dear, this has never been done before. She goes, oh, that'll be fun. So I knew when I got in the next day that in order to get my thoughts together about how to do this and how to make the funding and the authorization and the land come together, that I needed help. So I reached out to a lawyer by the name of David Iannucci. David was the chief fiscal officer for the General Assembly. He was second in command to what was then called Legislative Services. And I'd gotten to know David very, very well when I was counsel to the Senate. And I really respected his almost encyclopedic knowledge of Maryland statutes and laws. So I knew I needed him. Then I reached out to Bill Ratchford, who was the head of fiscal services for the legislature, who knew the budget inside and out. So I knew I needed his advice. So I basically went on a tour of advice. If you had to do this without capital funding, how would you do it? If you had to do this with land you didn't have, how would you do it? And then I found a guy by the name of Bob Frierson, an attorney in the AG's office, who was the expert, one of the experts on eminent domain, and I grabbed him. And so I started to put together the various resources from the people I thought I would need in order to figure out how do you put this whole thing together. Now, realize I only had basically 2 months to do it. He was going to announce all this when he came into office, and he'd already pre-announced it to the press that he was doing this. So he couldn't fail. So that's how it all landed on my desk.
You mentioned a few, but are there any other stories or specific memories
Of how
with
the
Schaefer?
Oh yeah, so
With Camden Yard specifically?
many. So let me begin with the bill itself. So we finally came to the conclusion we needed 3 pieces of legislation. We needed to empower the Maryland Stadium Authority. That is, what were their roles and responsibilities going to be? And our view for the Maryland Stadium Authority was it was going to have the power to enter into contracts for construction, secure the land, oversee the project, work with the architects, and be responsible as the steward of the Maryland project on behalf of the people of the state of Maryland. So we would have an entity that could carry out the function if we were to do this, because there's no other entity in Maryland that could have done it. You couldn't give it to the Department of Transportation or the Department of Education out of their bailiwick. So we created the Maryland Stadium Authority's functionality from soup to nuts. And included in that functionality, buried in the bill, was a thing called quick take eminent domain. Quick take eminent domain, which was Frierson's idea, essentially, normally, when government takes property, like they want to build an off-ramp or an on-ramp to a highway, the process is called eminent domain, and you go to the landowner, you negotiate with the landowner, and if the landowner accepts your price, then you get the land. But if the landowner rejects your price, then the government has to go to court and get a judge, because people have property rights in this country, give you due process to challenge the government's interest in taking your land. Sometimes you get it, sometimes a judge says no, but in all instances you have to go through a court proceeding where a judge gets to make that judgment. Quick take eminent domain skirted on the edge of constitutionality by giving the agency the right to take your property first, and then you got to go to court to see whether or not it gets undone. Completely shifts the responsibilities and allows for the property to immediately become governmental property at whatever the fair market value is. It is a very draconian thing to do to people, particularly people who have businesses, who have been in that Camden Yards area for years and so forth. But we thought that was the only way to do it, was to put that in the bill. It became a highly controversial provision. The second bill created the Camden Yards District. We knew that we needed to have a special footprint for Camden Yards that would be big enough for both football and baseball, to allow for that then to be the eminent domain district and also be the special taxing district that paid for the bill, that paid for the stadium. So that was the second piece of legislation. The third piece of legislation was the actual funding bill for Camden Yards. How was it going to be funded? How are we going to pay for those 2 stadiums? How are we going to pay for the infrastructure, the roads, the sewer, and all the other attributes that would go into what was then being estimated to be about a $280 million project. So those were the three bills. Now, we tied them together, which turned out to be a very valuable thing down the road when it was challenged legally, and we gave the Stadium Authority $100,000 of seed money from the general tax fund. It's the only general tax money that was used. But when we got the bills together and we're getting ready to file them, we didn't yet have a funding source for the stadiums. You follow what I'm saying here? We introduced the bills with a blank. We had no idea how yet to do it. So this is a particular picture of us walking down the hall in the State House, heading to what's called the clerk's office in the State House, where we were dropping off the legislation that created Camden Yards. So that's me. That's Mr. Frierson, who I mentioned to you. That's Mickey Steinberg. Oh, David Falk. He played a big role in that too. There's David Iannucci and others who were all part of my team. I had hired my staff by then of really fabulous lawyers. So the bills go in. They're tied together in a knot so that one can't pass without the other passing. If one fails, they all fail. Highly controversial set of bills, eminent domain, funding for a city, no process for payment is included into it. Have to take over 70 pieces of property owned by property owners that don't want to leave. You can only imagine the level of controversy. But there were two other major controversies at the same time, and like most things in politics, they get tied together. So we're already doing a dive. If you ever watch the Olympics, we're doing a 10 out of a 10 dive to do something that's never been done before. Two stadiums when we have a functioning memorial stadium and no way to fund it. So that's a 10 out of 10 dive. At the same time, the state of Maryland received $450 million in a rebate from the federal government based on some tax credits that the state was eligible for. The very powerful Maryland Senate and House leaders wanted that $450 million returned to the people of the state of Maryland in a tax rebate. Schaefer didn't want to do that. Schaefer wanted the $450 million to go to support programs in Baltimore City and other places that he felt were underfunded by the budget. Became a very, very, very controversial political dispute. So I was heavily involved in those negotiations between the Senate, the House, and the governor. And the governor had his view, and the Senate president and the speaker had their views. After many, many, many weeks of negotiating, and I was told they would not take up the stadium bills, wouldn't even have a hearing, wouldn't even give me a hearing, unless I could cure this problem first. I came up with a solution. The governor would get